Hi, I'm Rob Alway with the Great Lakes Boat Blog. Behind me are propellers that have come off the various car ferries that have served out of the Ludington fleet. The Ludington car ferry fleet began in 1897 with the debut of the steel car ferry, the SS Pere Marquette. The second car ferry to join the fleet was the wooden ship, the Pere Marquette 16, which was the only wooden ship to ever serve the Ludington car ferry fleet. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's Great Lakes Boat Blog.
Today's episode is presented by Filer Credit Union, with Michigan locations in Manistee, Bear Lake, Parkdale, and Ludington, and the Mason County Historical Society's Port of Ludington Maritime Museum, located in Ludington, Michigan, home of the historic SS Badger. The service of the SS Pere Marquette 16, the only wooden car ferry to operate in the Ludington fleet, was a mixture of historical significance, both good and bad. The ship under a different name was one of the first of two car ferries to sail on Lake Erie. It was the first car ferry to sail out of Muskegon, and it was the only wooden ship in the Pere Marquette Railway ferry fleet. But its service was plagued with misfortune that climaxed with going down in history as the first Great Lakes car ferry to experience a crew death. The Pere Marquette 16 was a wooden ship designed by famed naval architect Frank E. Kirby, who designed the first Lake Michigan car ferries, Ann Arbor No. 1 and No. 2, and the famed boblo boats that transported passengers from Detroit to Boblo Island, Ontario, among many other late 19th century and early 20th century steamships. The PM-16 began its existence as the Shenango No. 2. It was built by the Craig Shipbuilding Company out of Toledo, Ohio in 1895 for the United States and Ontario Steam Navigation. The Shenango No. 2 was 282 feet long, 53 feet wide, and had a depth of 19.4 feet. Like the first two Ann Arbor Railway car ferries, the Shenango was equipped with an ice-breaking propeller in its bow. It was 22 feet longer than the Ann Arbor No. 1 and 18 feet longer than the Ann Arbor No. 2. Its engines were built by S.F. Hodges and Company of Detroit, and its 4 Scotch boilers were built by Globe Iron Works. The United States and Ontario Steam Navigation Company was a subsidiary of the Pittsburgh, Shenango, and Lake Erie Railway, the predecessor of the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railway. The company was formed to operate ferries on Lake Erie from Conneaut, Ohio, to a connection with the Grand Trunk Railway at Port Dover, Ontario, 65 miles to the northeast. The new route represented saving 82 miles on the haul from Pennsylvania coal fields to the steel mills at Hamilton. The company anticipated that traffic would require 3 trips per day in each direction. Accordingly, it planned a pair of ferries, each of which would make 1.5 trips per day. Both ships were plagued with misfortune and turmoil before they were even built. Frank E. Kirby was associated with the shipbuilding firm Detroit Dry Dock and had expected the bid for the 2 ships to go to that company. When the order was given to Craig Shipbuilding, Kirby underwent a struggle to receive his design fee of $6,000. The first ship, Shenango No. 1, went into service in September 1895, and Shenango No. 2 followed in January 1896. They were both nearly identical. The new ferries could handle about 26 rail cars, each at a speed of 10 to 11 knots, which is 12 to 13 miles per hour. They were expected to make the trip in 5.5 to 6 hours, but Shenango No. 1 made its first round trip in 13 hours. The first mishap of the Shenango No. 2 occurred within a month of it entering service. Contrary to the intentions of its designer and builder, the new ships quickly proved themselves poor icebreakers, presumably because of lack of power. They were initially reported to be rated at 2,000 horsepower each, but both demonstrated an utter inability to work out of ice entrapments. On February 9, 1896, Shenango No. 2 broke its starboard screw and damaged its port screw in the ice on its regular route. It went to Cleveland for repairs. The dry docks there were too small, and the boat sailed for the Craig Yard in Toledo on February 12th at 3:35 a.m. It made slow progress in the ice until it lost its forward screw, making it essentially helpless, being unable to make any progress in the ice. It was shortly totally engulfed in a windrow, where it remained for a week. Craig had retained a financial interest in the ships and was eager that Shenango No. 2 be dry docked. Since the ship showed little prospect of reaching Toledo, the ice-breaking passenger ferries Promise and Fortune were dispatched from Windsor, Ontario on February 19, 1896 to extricate it and tow it to Detroit. They reached the Shenango No. 2 on February 20th at 6:15 p.m. and began their efforts to work it free at 7 a.m. on the following day. By 5 p.m., they had it out of the windrow, but they lay off Paley Island overnight and spent February 22nd inching toward the mouth of the Detroit River. They put into Amherstburg, Ontario for coal on the morning of February 23rd, and by evening arrived at Detroit Dry Dock, where the ferry was repaired. A towing bill of $5,000 was added to the repair expenses. Traffic on the newly established Lake Erie route proved adequate for just one vessel, and on December 1st, 1897, the Shenango No. 2 was leased to the Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Western Railway. On December 27th, 1897, the Shenango No. 2 became the first car ferry to operate from Muskegon, Michigan to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The DGR&W purchased the ship a year later and renamed it Muskegon on December 9th, 1898. The life of the Shenango No. 1 was cut short. It passed hands to the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company on its formation in 1903, but unfortunately, it burned on March 11th, 1904. It was a total loss. The Pere Marquette Railway was created on January 1st, 1900 with the merger of the Flint and Pere Marquette, Chicago and West Michigan, and Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Western. With this merger came the acquisition of the Ludington-based fleet that included the steel car ferry SS Pere Marquette, built in 1897, and the breakbulk freighters Flint and Pere Marquette No. 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the Muskegon-based car ferry SS Muskegon. As a result of the merger, the railroad consolidated its eastern Lake Michigan terminus to Ludington and moved the Muskegon to Ludington. Though traffic from Muskegon, Michigan was adequate, the railroad had a couple of reasons for adding another ship to Ludington. The more ships move in and out of a harbor in winter months, the easier it is to maintain a channel through the ice. Therefore, a single terminus on the east side of the lake was preferable to two. Since pack ice formation is more severe on the east shore than the west because of prevailing winds, having several western terminals presents no similar problem. Also, dispatching out of a single eastern terminus would offer the railroad a higher degree of flexibility than was possible with two terminals. Traffic to Manitowoc was proving too much for Pere Marquette's 2 trips a day, even in 1900. The railroad intended to continue service out of Muskegon, Michigan in the summer months and left its slip intact. PM ferries ran in the summer from Muskegon, particularly for movements of Michigan fruit to Milwaukee in the harvest season until 1908. Thereafter, all service was provided from Ludington, and the Muskegon slip was removed. In addition to Lake Michigan service, the Pere Marquette was starting to get into the ferry business on the St. Clair River, boats that were very different designs than the larger Lake Michigan ferries. In 1901, the Pere Marquette changed the numbering schemes of its ships, adopting a system similar to how it named locomotives. The breakbulk freighters would be numbered 5 and lower. The Detroit River ferries would be 14 and lower. The Lake Michigan car ferries would be 15 and above. The SS Muskegon became the SS Pere Marquette 16, with the newest vessel, the Pere Marquette 17, scheduled to arrive that year. 3 other ships would eventually join the fleet: the PM-18 in 1902, the PM-19, and PM-20 in 1903. The Pere Marquette, designed by naval architect Robert Logan, had entered service in 1897 as the first steel car ferry on the Great Lakes and the first car ferry operated by the Flint and Pere Marquette Railway. It retained the name Pere Marquette until 1924, when it officially became the Pere Marquette 15. However, it had been unofficially known as the PM-15 up to that time. Logan had also designed the PM-17, 18, 19, and 20, along with the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2, built in 1905, and the Manistee Marquette and Northern 1, built in 1903, later renamed the Milwaukee in 1908, among others. Notably, the M&B No. 2 sank in 1909, the PM-18 sank in 1910, and the Milwaukee sank in 1929. Though slightly confusing, the respective railroads each ordered replacement ships, naming them the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 and the Pere Marquette 18. The Milwaukee was later replaced with the City of Milwaukee, which is now a museum ship in Manistee, Michigan. Another unique aspect of the PM-16 was that, with the exception of its first 2 years, the ship had the same master throughout its entire existence as a car ferry, even as it passed hands through 3 companies and changed names an equal amount of times. The first skipper of the Shenango No. 2 was Frank A. Doherty, who commanded multiple Pere Marquette ships. But George L. Thompson was truly the master of the ship, as he operated it from 1897 until it was laid up in Ludington 10 years later. Thompson had supposedly been offered other commands but insisted on staying with the PM-16. In 1877, at the age of 20, he began working for the Northwest Transportation Company with the goal of becoming a steamship captain. He started as a watchman on the steamer Quebec. He remained at Northwest for 3 years, becoming a wheelsman, then second mate on the steamer Ontario. In August 1881, he married Edith R. Flood, the daughter of retired Captain Daniel Flood. The Thompsons had 3 children, William, Lulu, and Hazel. The family called Milwaukee home. Thompson then began working on the schooner Seaman for 2 seasons. In 1882, he began working on the Northerner as wheelsman, and in 1883, he worked on the steamer Horace B. Tuttle before moving to the Iron Age. He then worked on a steamship called Milwaukee, not the car ferry discussed earlier in this article, where he also served as a wheelsman. He was then on the Fountain City for 3 seasons and became a second mate and then first mate. He finally became a captain when he served on the Colorado, first as second mate, then as its first mate, and finally as captain. In 1892, he was captain of the Osceola and then returned as captain of the Colorado in 1893. Also that year, he began his car ferry career serving as captain of the Ann Arbor No. 1 and Ann Arbor No. 2. He held captain positions also on the schooner George W. Johnson in 1894, the Rhoda Emily in 1895, and the George L. Caldwell. In 1897, he became master of the Shenango No. 2, 2 years after the ship began service. For many years, a sandbar just outside the Ludington pierheads plagued ships. By 1904, the Ludington Record of Appeal reported that 3 ships had run aground in nearly the same place, with 2 of the incidents resulting each in the death of a crewman. The first such incident happened on December 31st, 1884, when the Flint Pere Marquette No. 1 breakbulk freighter, under the command of Captain Hugh Clark, ran into the sandbar in between the 2 pierheads as it entered the harbor at daybreak. The undertow quickly carried the ship outside where it had been scuttled. The boat remained scuttled until spring, when it was taken to Milwaukee and repaired. While the FNPM No. 1 had the unfortunate distinction of being the first ship in the railroad's fleet to experience an accident that resulted in a crew death, the Pere Marquette 16 will go down in history as the first Lake Michigan car ferry to be involved in an accident that resulted in a crew death. The circumstances of the 2 incidents were nearly identical. On December 21st, 1901, PM-16 left Milwaukee at 4 p.m. with 26 cars. It entered a southerly gale with winds 45 to 50 miles per hour mid-lake, but reached Ludington shortly before midnight without any particular difficulty. About 350 feet off the pierhead, a wave drove the ship down hard against a sandbar, which had built up, causing it to lose its way and drift helplessly. This was one of the worst of this familiar sort of accident, where the impact broke not only the ship's back, but also its main steam connections between the boilers and the engines. Escaping steam scalded 3 of its engine room crew, one of whom, Michael Toff of Chicago, was burned beyond recognition, and according to newspaper accounts, died shortly after the incident occurred. Toff, on his first trip, apparently could not find his way out of the engine room to safety. Newspaper accounts stated that Toff was married and had 2 young children. Also injured was co-passer Frank Liu of Milwaukee and William Weber of Tonawanda, New York, whose hands and face were burned. One newspaper account stated that he likely would die due to inhaling steam. However, no reference is made later that he passed away as a result of the accident. The PM-16 was still often referred to as the Muskegon, as stated in one Newswire story found in multiple newspapers. The ship, having no power, was driven against the north breakwater, where pounding by the waves opened several holes in its port forward quarter. Captain Thompson, seeing that the ship was in imminent danger of breaking up, ordered it scuttled. It sank in 16 feet of water about 100 feet off the pierhead, exposed to the wind and waves without heat or light. The engine room crew took shelter on the tops of cars on the main deck, lifting the 3 injured men to positions of relative safety. With the exception of Toff, the rest of the crew of 34 survived. The sea showered tons of ice on the ship. Lighthouse keeper E. Slyfield notified Pere Marquette Superintendent of Steamships W.L. Mercereau and Chief Steward James Magmer of the incident. They went to the pier to assess the situation. At daybreak, the life-saving crew under Ben Carlson fired a line to remove the crew. The steamer had been scuttled and lay hard aground a Newswire article stated. A breeches buoy shot was fired from the shore, but the line parted. The second shot was more successful, the line falling across the car ferry's spar deck. Cable communication between the boat and the pier was quickly established, and over this line, the entire crew of 34 men were hauled to the pier. The rescue occupied 4 hours of time. The Muskegon Chronicle reported that the ship contained 26 loaded cars, 8 which contained beef. The value of the cargo was $40,000, which is about $1.5 million in today's dollars. Captain Thompson was the last man ashore, the Chronicle reported. He could not conceal his emotion, and he cried when he left the steamer. When questioned regarding the cause of the accident, Superintendent Mercereau of the Pere Marquette steamship line declared that it was an accident which might befall any boat. They all knew that the bar existed, but it was a long chance that any would be submerged at the exact spot. Absolutely no blame can be attached to Captain Thompson, said Superintendent Mercereau. He did all that any man could do under the circumstances. Most newspapers predicted the ship was a total loss. Captain James Reed of Sarnia, Ontario, was called to oversee the salvation operation. The PM-16 was freed on December 28th by the SS Pere Marquette, commanded by Captain John Ackerman, with the assistance of the tugs Sport, W.H. Meyer, John C. Mann, and Frank Canfield. On December 29th, the 16 was berthed at No. 1 Slip in Ludington for inspection and removal of its rail cars. On January 1st, 1902, the ship left Ludington in tow of the PM-3 and PM-4, with the tug W.H. Meyer following behind to steer the disabled ship. They arrived in Milwaukee at 5 p.m. after 14 hours. The PM-16 was repaired at the South Yard of the Milwaukee Dry Dock Company at a cost of more than $80,000. The ship was then returned to service. The Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company was formed as a joint venture between the Pere Marquette Railway and the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railway, which had succeeded the bankrupt Pittsburgh, Shenango, and Lake Erie Railroad in 1902. In 1903, to help with ferry traffic on Lake Erie, the PM-16 was brought back to its original port to assist its sister ship, the Shenango No. 1. The PM-16 then returned to Ludington in September 1905. It was then leased to the Ann Arbor Railway in 1906 for service out of Frankfort and Alberta, Michigan, to Green Bay, Wisconsin. It was laid up in 1907 and then sold in 1917 to Peter Edwards of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, who sold her to Hammer Mill Paper Company of Erie, Pennsylvania. The ship's name was changed to Harriet B. on March 21, 1918, and its superstructure was cut down for use as a steam barge. The engines were removed, and it was enrolled as an unrigged barge on June 18, 1921. The Harriet B. foundered on May 3, 1922 in Lake Superior near Two Harbors, Minnesota. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Great Lakes Boat Blog is written and produced by myself, Rob Alway of Media Group 31, in partnership with Savo Points Media. The Great Lakes Boat Blog is a presentation of Filer Credit Union and the Mason County Historical Society's Port of Ludington Maritime Museum. All material is copyrighted.